He came to the square almost every afternoon, always at the same time, always with the same slow steps. People noticed him, but not in a kind way. Some barely looked at him at all. Others looked just long enough to decide who they thought he was. A man with worn shoes, a jacket too thin for the season, hair that had not seen a proper mirror in a long time. He'd never asked for money. He never spoke unless spoken to. Still, people had already written his story in their minds. The square itself was loud and alive. Street sellers called out their prices. Buses hissed as they stopped and started. Children ran across the open space, laughing and shouting. In the middle of it all sat an old public piano under a simple shade roof. The paint on it was chipped. Some keys were scratched, but it still worked. Many people tried it for fun. Some played a few notes and laughed. Some filmed short videos and walked away. The piano was part of the noise, part of the background. The man never rushed toward it. He stayed on a bench a few steps away, close enough to hear every sound, far enough to pretend he was not interested. He sat straight, hands folded, eyes lowered most of the time. If someone else played the piano, his head would lift slightly. His eyes followed the hands, not the person. It was like he was listening to something deeper than the sound itself. People began to recognize him as part of the place. It's like the lampposts or the cracked tiles. He's always here, some would say. Does he even do anything? Others joked quietly. Few laughed louder than they should have. No one asked his name. No one asked why he came every day. It was easier to laugh than to wonder. His life had not always been this quiet. There was a time when sound filled his days. Not noise, but real sound. Music that carried meaning. In those days, his hands were strong and sure. They moved with purpose. But life has a way of closing doors without warning. One problem leads to another. One loss makes the next easier to survive but harder to heal from. Over time, the world he knew slowly slipped away. He learned early that explaining himself did not change much. People hear what they want to hear, so he stopped trying. Silence became safer. Silence did not argue back. Silence did not judge. On this day, the air felt heavier than usual, clouds hung low, and the wind pushed small bits of paper across the ground. The man arrived as he always did and sat on his bench. He watched a group of young people gather around the piano. They were loud, full of energy. One of them banged the keys with both hands, making a mess of sound. The others laughed and clapped like it was something special. The man looked down at his own hands. The skin was rough. The fingers were long but thin. Small scars crossed his knuckles, reminders of work that had nothing to do with music. He slowly flexed his fingers, then stopped. He did not want to draw attention. Someone in the group noticed him staring. "Hey," the person said, not unkindly but not kindly either. "You waiting for your turn?" A few heads turned. The man felt the weight of their eyes. His first instinct was to look away. He shook his head slightly. The group laughed anyway. Not because he said something funny, but because he was there. Because he looked out of place in their world of clean clothes and loud confidence. "Can you even play?" someone asked. The question was sharp, but it was wrapped in a smile. Kind of smile that already knows the answer at once. The man did not respond. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his jacket, and took a step back, creating more distance between himself and the piano. "Didn't think so," another voice said. The words were not shouted, but they carried. A few passers-by slowed down, sensing something was happening. The man felt his chest tighten.
Not from anger,
but from a familiar ache. This moment had played out many times in different ways. Different places, different faces, same result. He sat back down. His shoulders sagged slightly as if he had just put down a heavy bag no one else could see. The group moved on, bored now. The piano was left alone again. Square returned to its normal rhythm. But something inside the man had shifted. It was small, almost nothing, but it was there. He closed his eyes for a moment. Sounds blended together. Footsteps, voices, the soft hum of traffic. Beneath it all, he imagined another sound. One he knew well. One he had not allowed himself to fully remember in a long time. Years ago, he used to sit at a piano every morning, not in a public square, but in a quiet room where the light came in just right. Back then, his hands did not shake. Back then, people listened. Not everyone, but enough. He remembered the feeling of pressing a key and knowing exactly what would come next. He remembered the calm it brought him, even when everything else felt wrong. That life ended without warning. There was no dramatic goodbye, just a series of events that made it impossible to continue. Work replaced practice. Survival replaced dreams. Music became something he carried inside instead of something he shared. He opened his eyes. The piano sat there, empty. No one was playing. No one was watching. For a brief second, the square felt like it belonged only to him. His heart beat faster. His mind argued with itself. He told himself it was pointless. He told himself it would only bring more laughter. He told himself he was too tired, too old, too forgotten. Every excuse lined up neatly, ready to protect him from disappointment. Still, his feet moved. It was not a bold step. It was small and careful, like testing thin ice. He stood up again and walked toward the piano. Each step felt louder than it really was. He could feel eyes on him, though he could not tell how many. A few people noticed. Some whispered. Some smiled in a way that made his stomach tighten. He reached the piano and stopped. Out. His hands hovered above the keys, not touching them yet. The surface was cool, familiar. He breathed in slowly, then out. His shoulders relaxed just a little. He did not sit right away. He listened first, to the space. To the silence waiting to be filled, a voice from behind said, "Is he serious?" He sat down. The bench creaked under his weight. He placed his hands in his lap and closed his eyes again. It's not to escape, but to remember. In that moment, the square faded. The noise faded. He was no longer the man people ignored. He was just a man sitting in front of a piano like he had done countless times before. His fingers slowly lifted. Just before they touched the keys, doubt rushed back in. What if he had lost it?
Ow.
What if his hands no longer remembered what his heart did? What if this was the moment that proved everyone right? He paused. Someone cleared their throat nearby. A phone camera was raised, waiting, hoping maybe for a mistake. The man opened his eyes. He looked at the keys. Not all of them. Just the first one he planned to press. He knew this moment. Its edge between fear and truth. His finger moved. The sound had not come yet, but the choice had already been made. Whatever happened next, he would no longer be invisible. The square had settled back into its usual rhythm. But the quiet tension around the piano felt different now. People had stopped to watch, curious about the man who had just taken a seat. Whispers floated through the air, half expecting him to do nothing, half wondering if something unexpected might happen. Children slowed their running, a few vendors paused mid-call, and even the usual noisy teenagers gathered nearby, sensing a little drama. The man sat with his hands hovering above the keys. For a moment, the world around him seemed to shrink. He felt the familiar nervousness he had not experienced in years. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from anticipation. He reminded himself that music was a friend that never judged. The keys under his fingers would tell the story if he could only trust them. "Are you really going to play?" Someone whispered from behind a camera phone. There was laughter in the question, but it carried a challenge too. Some people laughed again. Others exchanged looks, the kind of looks that silently agreed that this would be entertaining. The man ignored them. His eyes stayed on the keys, on the first note he would strike. He drew a slow breath. Memories rushed back. Long afternoons. In a small, sunlit room, where his hands had moved as if the piano itself guided them. He remembered the way his fingers had danced over the keys, how the music had spoken louder than words ever could. He remembered applause. But more than that, he remembered the calm. The sense of being alive in a way nothing else could provide. The crowd's laughter and whispers began to fade as he flexed his fingers and placed them gently on the keys. 1, 2, 3 fingers pressed down, testing the sound, finding the notes that had been waiting inside him all these years. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory guide him. It was not showmanship, it was instinct. A few people leaned closer. Cameras clicked. There was an uneasy mix of expectation and doubt. They had laughed at him before. They assumed he would fail. But the man did not think about them. He thought about the music. He thought about the years of silence, the practice done in secret, the moments when he played to survive, to remember, to hope. The first note sounded soft, almost shy, but precise. A few onlookers frowned. "Is that it?" someone muttered. But as his fingers moved to the next keys, the sound changed. It grew fuller, richer, more confident. The melody unfolded slowly at first, hesitant, as if the piano itself was testing the waters. Then the man began to play with feeling, each note carrying weight and emotion. His hands moved with a familiarity that spoke of years of struggle, of life lived quietly yet deeply. Some of the young people who had laughed now froze. Their mouths that had been ready to mock stayed closed. Passers-by stopped and turned, caught by the unexpected beauty. Even those who knew nothing about music felt something shift inside. There was a story in the notes, a story without words, but impossible to ignore. The man's body swayed slightly with the rhythm. His fingers glided, not rushed, not showy, just honest and precise. Every note seemed to echo a part of his life. People began to notice the scars on his knuckles, the tiredness in his eyes, the quiet determination that refused to be shaken. The sound coming from him was more than talented, was survival, it was expression. It was defiance against a world that had overlooked him. Whispers turned into murmurs of awe. "He can really play. I didn't expect that." Even the loud teenagers were quiet now, leaning forward with wide eyes. Cameras recorded everything, but no one dared interrupt. The man did not look up. He was not playing for fame or attention. He was playing because he had to, because the music inside him demanded release. The piano was an old friend, and he had promised himself that no amount of judgment would stop him from returning to it, at least once. A few people were moved to tears without knowing why. Some remembered their own dreams left aside. Some thought of loved ones, past mistakes, unspoken feelings. The music touched everyone differently. But the effect was the same. Silence where there had been noise. Reflection where there had been laughter. Then the piece shifted. He moved into a more complex part, with fast fingers and delicate touches. The crowd gasped quietly. This was not just competence. It was mastery. He was not just playing. He was telling his story through melody. Every rising note, every soft landing, spoke of hope, of struggle, of resilience. For a brief moment, it was as if the square no longer existed. Only the music remained. Only the man and his piano. He had become invisible to the distractions and judgments around him. In that moment, he reclaimed a part of his life that had been denied. And the audience felt it without knowing why. The man paused briefly, a small breath between sections. He sensed the shift in the crowd. People who had laughed at him before now stared, captivated. They had come expecting amusement. They had found something extraordinary. Even those who had mocked him found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew about talent, about appearances, about judgment. The music resumed, flowing with more confidence, more power. He did not rush. Each note landed exactly where it should, building a story that was uniquely his own. His fingers were alive, moving as if guided by memory, by instinct, by the heartbeat of life itself. Each chord struck a balance between vulnerability and strength. A small group of older people gathered closer. They recognized the skill, the years of practice, the dedication that only someone truly committed could possess. A few whispered, "He must have trained somewhere. He must have learned from someone great." But the truth was simpler. He had trained himself through patience, through loss, through quiet moments alone with music as his only companion. The man's eyes remained half closed. He did not notice the cameras, the people, the whispers of admiration. He played for himself first, and then, inevitably, for everyone who had doubted him. The contrast between his quiet appearance and the richness of his music was striking. It made people question their assumptions. How could someone so humble and unnoticed create something so powerful? Slowly, he began to move toward the finale of the piece. The notes soared and dipped, painting emotions across the square. Some people cried silently, holding their breath. Others whispered encouragements, afraid to break the spell. A few skeptics still lingered, unsure if what they heard was real. But even they could not hide their awe. As he pressed the final chord, it hung in the air for a long moment. Silence followed. Not the usual shift back to noise, but a silence filled with wonder, with reflection. With the weight of what had just been experienced, people were not moving. They were processing, understanding that something unexpected and remarkable had occurred. The man slowly lifted his hands from the keys. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. He opened his eyes fully, taking in the crowd for the first time since he had started. There were no jokes, no whispers of mockery, just faces of admiration, shock, and newfound respect. Some clapped softly at first, then more confidently. Applause grew, and a few voices cheered. Cameras recorded every reaction, but even recording could not capture the emotion in the air. The man did not bow. He did not speak. He simply nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that he had returned, that he had reminded the world what it had overlooked. The square had changed, even if only for a moment. People left with a story to tell, one they would remember for days, weeks, perhaps years. The man returned to his quiet bench nearby, not seeking recognition, not basking in the attention. He had proven to himself more than anyone else. The music had spoken, and it had been heard. He closed his eyes again, letting the notes echo in his mind. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving the square as lively as before, but with a different energy lingering in the air. People were quieter, more reflective. Some looked around for the man, half expecting him to vanish into the crowd. Half hoping to see him play again, he sat there, hands folded, calm, knowing that this was only the beginning of a change he had carried inside for years. Music had reclaimed him, even in a world that had tried to ignore him. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of belonging. Not because the crowd had applauded, but because he had trusted himself enough to play. The man's fingers hovered above the keys for a brief moment, feeling the cold wood, the worn edges, the small imperfections that made the piano alive. Around him, the crowd had grown quieter, the earlier whispers now replaced by a curious tension. No one moved. It was as if the air itself waited for what would come next. He had played, but that was only the beginning. Now he had to let the music tell its story fully. He started slowly, soft notes that floated like a gentle breeze over the square. People leaned forward, their eyes fixed on him. They could feel the difference between someone who knew music and someone who did not. The simple notes he played at first were not impressive in speed or complexity, but they carried emotion, a weight that made people stop in their tracks. The young man who had laughed at him before now had a look of confusion and fascination. He had expected a failure, a moment of mockery. Instead, he faced a quiet power that could not be ignored. The man's eyes were half closed, his body still and relaxed. His mind was fully in the moment, not thinking about the crowd or their judgment. Every note he pressed came from memory, from years of quiet practice, from a life filled with small struggles and small victories. He had learned long ago that music could carry the feelings that words could not. Today, he let those feelings rise, not for fame, not for recognition, but because they had waited too long to be released. Slowly, the melody became more complex. The simple notes grew into chords, each pressed with precision, each carrying a subtle rise and fall that painted a picture of resilience. People in the crowd shifted. Some held their phones up, afraid to miss a moment. Others simply stood in awe, understanding that what they were witnessing was rare, something authentic. Even the children who had run and shouted moments before had stopped, curious and silent. Watching the man bring life to the piano, a woman in her 40s whispered to a friend, "He's amazing." How? How can he play like that? The man did not hear her. His ears were tuned to the music, his hands moving in a rhythm that had been ingrained into him long ago. The square had faded around him. He was no longer aware of the noise of buses, the calls of vendors, or the murmurs of the crowd. It was only him and the piano, the sound of each key vibrating through his body. each note echoing the years he had spent in silence. The music began to change tone. It became richer, deeper, expressing emotions that were hard to name. There was a story in the sound, a journey of struggle, of pain, of hope. People felt it without understanding why. Their hearts caught on the rhythm, their eyes softened. The man's skill was no longer just talent. It was a bridge between his life and the lives of everyone around him. Each chord reached out and touched something hidden inside the listener. A few of the teens who had mocked him earlier were now standing frozen. One whispered, "I didn't expect." Another shook his head slowly. They had come ready to laugh, but they had encountered something they could not define. The man had revealed a part of himself that could not be judged by clothes, by posture, by appearances. He moved into the middle section of the piece, where the melody required both strength and subtlety. His hands flew over the keys, precise yet fluid, strong yet tender. The crowd gasped quietly. Some leaned closer to hear every note. Even the vendors, who had only paused briefly, now stopped calling to customers, mesmerized by the sound. The music was no longer just a performance. It was a conversation, a sharing of life and emotion, a quiet revelation. The man's eyes remained closed, but he could sense the change in the crowd. Their skepticism was gone, replaced by something that resembled awe. Some people nodded subtly, as if acknowledging a skill they had never expected. Others wiped tears quietly, unsure why they were moved. The young man who had first mocked him looked embarrassed, his laughter replaced by wonder. He had underestimated the quiet figure who had sat unnoticed for so long. With each rising note, the music carried more intensity, more story. The man pressed harder when the emotions demanded it, softened when they called for gentleness. His breathing matched the rhythm, subtle but steady. This was not about technique alone. It was about communicating everything he had kept inside, everything that had been dismissed, ignored, overlooked. A middle-aged man who had stopped to watch commented softly to a friend, "It's like he's telling his whole life story with those keys." The music shifted again, slower now, reflective. It was a passage of remembrance, of memory, of all the moments he had lost and found along the way. The square seemed to listen, as if it too had paused to give respect. A few people shifted closer to catch every nuance. Recognizing the complexity behind the seemingly simple man before them, the man continued, fingers moving with precision, confidence, and care. Each note was deliberate. Each chord had meaning. He played with the knowledge that he was not performing for the crowd. He was sharing something far deeper. People around him could sense it. They leaned forward, silent but attentive. Drawn by the honesty of the music, he reached a high point. A moment where the music surged and swelled, filling every corner of the square. The sounds were not just notes, they were emotion made audible. The wind seemed to quiet down, the distant traffic faded, and only the music remained. Some people closed their eyes, letting the sound fill them. Others whispered quietly to those nearby, trying to describe what they felt, but finding words insufficient. The man's hands moved faster now, not frantic, but alive, telling a story that was unfolding with each keystroke. His past, his struggles, his long years of being ignored and underestimated poured into the music. It was impossible for the crowd to dismiss him now. They were witnesses to the culmination of talent, patience, and resilience. As the music softened again, he moved to a more delicate section. Fingers danced lightly across the keys, creating a subtle, almost fragile melody that spoke of hope, of small joys, quiet victories that life often hides. People felt it deeply, without fully understanding why. Some smiled softly, remembering their own moments of quiet triumph. Others felt a lump in their throats. Moved by the honesty and beauty of the sound, the man was fully present in the music. Yet he could sense the effect he had on the crowd. The laughter that had greeted him before had vanished. The whispers had turned into admiration and wonder. Cameras continued to record, but they could not capture the soul of what was happening. That soul resided in the man, in his fingers. In the space between the notes, he paused briefly again, letting a chord resonate. The moment was quiet, powerful. People leaned in without moving, as if any sound of life outside the music might break the spell. The man's eyes opened slowly, scanning the crowd, not for recognition, but for connection. He saw faces that had mocked him, and now they were silent, transformed. He saw strangers whose lives had been touched by a few minutes of sound. He saw a small child staring with wide eyes, absorbing the mystery of talent so unexpectedly found. The music continued, building to another emotional climax. Strong chords, subtle transitions, moments of softness and intensity, all blended together. Each note told a piece of the story the man had carried for years. The square had become a witness to a hidden world, a place where talent, patience, and emotion converged to create something unforgettable. Finally, the piece began to wind down, slowing naturally, settling into a quiet, reflective ending. The man's fingers lingered on the final keys, letting them echo. He took a breath, calm, satisfied. The crowd remained silent for a long moment, processing the beauty and depth of what they had just experienced. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the square. Soft at first, tentative, then growing in intensity. People clapped, cheered quietly, moved by the unexpected display of genius. The man did not rise, did not bow. He simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the shared moment. He returned to his quiet bench nearby, hands folded, breathing slowly. He had revealed a part of himself long hidden, shared something only music could convey. And for the first time in years, he felt seen, not because of fame, but because he had trusted himself enough to play. The applause in the square grew louder, filling the space with energy that was both surprising and rewarding. The man sat back slightly on the bench, letting the sound wash over him. He did not seek it, but he felt it, a quiet recognition that he had not known in years. Faces that had mocked him before now looked at him with something between awe and respect. It was a strange feeling, one he had almost forgotten existed. Some people came closer. They wanted to see the man who had produced such incredible music from a worn-out public piano in a busy square. Cameras and phones were raised, but he did not focus on them. He had no desire for attention or fame. He had only wanted to play, to give life to the music he had carried quietly for so long. A few teenagers who had laughed at him earlier lingered, clearly trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. One whispered to another, I didn't know he could play like that. I thought it would be nothing." The other nodded, still in disbelief. The crowd had grown around him, strangers drawn together by something beyond words. Some faces were wet with tears, others smiling softly, and a few people simply stared, unable to move. The man's breathing was steady. His hands rested lightly on his lap, but he could still feel the music vibrating inside him. He had shared something deeply personal, and it had been received with more honesty than he could have imagined. In that moment, he realized that talent, when hidden, could create wonder beyond expectation. It did not need a stage, a crowd, or validation. It only needed honesty. A woman in the front whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't expect this from him, or anyone." Another man, older, nodded slowly. "It's been years since I heard something that moved me like this," he said quietly. "Years." The man looked around, noticing the subtle shifts in expression. Faces softened, eyes widened, hearts opened. What had begun as laughter and mockery had turned into shared awe. People who had doubted him before now respected him, not for his words, not for his appearance, but for his talent, his dedication, and his courage. A few people approached, asking questions softly. "How long have you played?" one asked. Another whispered, "Did you study somewhere?" The man answered quietly, not wanting attention, but he smiled slightly, a small recognition of curiosity and interest. He explained simply that music had always been part of him, that he had played for years in quiet spaces, teaching himself, learning from memory, from life. From heart, the questions did not matter as much as the fact that people were listening, truly listening, not just hearing. They were connecting. They were understanding that the man before them was not defined by his appearance, by the worn jacket, by the quiet demeanor. He was defined by what he could express, by what he had nurtured quietly, and now, finally, had shared. Some younger people, who had initially mocked him, were now nodding and whispering to one another. "We judged him too quickly," one said. "I can't believe it." Another added softly, "I feel wrong for laughing." They had learned a lesson without even realizing it. Respect and understanding had replaced their teasing. The man rose slowly from the bench, returning to the piano. The crowd sensed something new was about to happen. He did not need to speak. His presence commanded attention. This time, he did not just play. He improvised, letting the music flow freely, letting it speak not only of his life, but of the shared human experience. Notes lifted and fell, soft and strong, happy and sad, urgent and calm. The square was alive with the sound, and people felt it in their bones. Each note carried history, each chord told a story. Some listeners closed their eyes, imagining their own memories, their own struggles, their own small victories. The music reached into their hearts without needing explanation. For those few minutes, the world outside the square, the noise, the hurry, the busyness, all faded. There was only the piano, only the man, only the connection between sound and soul. A few people started recording on their phones, but even they felt that no video could capture the depth of what was happening. Cameras could show hands moving across keys, but not the emotions, not the years of quiet practice, not the courage it had taken to sit down in front of strangers. That was something each person had to feel themselves. The piece he played began to rise to a gentle crescendo. People gasped quietly at the power, the emotion, the honesty. The crowd had become a witness to something rare. Some whispered to one another about what they were hearing. Others simply stood, unable to find words, letting the music tell the story instead. As he played, the man's eyes remained closed, but he could sense the subtle nods, the smiles, the tears. He had turned doubt into wonder, laughter into awe, mockery into respect. For years he had been invisible, unnoticed, underestimated. But now, with nothing more than music and honesty, he had changed the way people saw him, the way they understood talent, and perhaps even the way they judged others. Slowly, the music softened again, gentle, reflective, almost like a whisper of what had come before. People leaned closer, listening to every delicate note. Some wiped tears quietly. Others whispered words of appreciation, not wanting to break the fragile, beautiful moment. He played each note with care, with intention, as if the music was a bridge between himself and the crowd. As he reached the final notes, the square seemed to hold its breath. Silence filled the space between the keys and the audience. A moment of connection so profound that it could not be broken by noise or distraction. The last chord resonated and lingered, a soft echo that seemed to settle over everyone present. The crowd erupted in applause. It started slowly, uncertainly, but grew steadily. People clapped, cheered, some whistled quietly, overwhelmed by the talent and the emotions they had just witnessed. It was not the applause of a performance on a stage. It was deeper, more sincere. It was recognition of years of patience, of quiet struggle, of hidden brilliance finally revealed. The man did not bow, did not seek acknowledgement. He simply nodded slightly, a gesture of humble thanks. He had played not for applause, but for himself. And the recognition, while unexpected, was a welcome confirmation of what he had carried all along. He returned to his bench, hands folded, breathing slowly, letting the energy of the crowd wash over him. Some people came closer, wanting to speak, to understand, to thank him. Others lingered quietly, still absorbing what they had just experienced. The square had transformed, even if only for a moment. People who had come expecting amusement had been given awe. People who had come to pass by had been given a reminder of the power of patience, of dedication, of hidden talent. A few young people who had laughed at him earlier approached hesitantly. I didn't know anyone could play like that," one admitted. Another said softly, "I'm sorry for laughing before. I should have never judged you." The man smiled quietly, understanding that they were not just apologizing, but learning. He had given more than music. He had given a lesson in humility, respect, and the danger of quick judgments. The crowd slowly began to disperse, conversations buzzing with admiration and wonder. People left with a story to tell, memory of a quiet man who had shocked a busy square with nothing more than his skill and honesty. Cameras recorded, phones captured moments, but the true magic was something that could not be contained or replayed. It existed in the moment, in the shared experience, in the silent understanding between one man and the many who had gathered to witness his gift. The man remained seated, calm, satisfied, a quiet smile touching his lips. He had shared his music, his story, and his talent, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a part of himself that had long been hidden. The applause, the admiration, the newfound respect, they were not the goal. But they were a reminder that honesty, courage, and skill could not remain unnoticed forever. He looked at the piano one last time for the day, a familiar companion, a friend that had never judged him, and he rose slowly. The square returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of what had just happened lingered. People would carry it with them, silently or aloud. Inspired by the man who had turned laughter into amazement, underestimating into wonder, and strangers into witnesses of something extraordinary, the man walked slowly away from the piano, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The applause had faded, but the memory of it lingered, warm and satisfying. He did not hurry. There was no rush to leave the square, no need to seek attention. The music had done what words could not. It had spoken for him. It had told his story. It had shown the world something that had been hidden for far too long. People lingered, still talking in low voices, still shaking their heads in disbelief. Conversations buzzed around him, whispers spreading from one small group to another. "Did you see him play? I didn't know anyone could do that. He was amazing." Their words were sincere, free from mockery, free from judgment. It was a change not only in their perception of him, but in the way they saw talent, dedication, and courage. Some approached cautiously. They wanted to speak, to understand, to thank him for sharing something so rare. The man nodded politely, smiled quietly, answered simply when asked about his experience, his years of practice, and his love for music. He did not need to exaggerate, to boast, to perform. The music itself had been enough. It was honest, direct, human. A few children came closer, shy but curious. They asked questions, whispered about how beautiful it sounded, about how they had never heard music like that before. The man spoke gently, encouraging them, telling them to play and explore their own talent, to never let others' opinions stop them. His words were soft but carried weight. He understood that encouragement could mean more than applause. That guidance could plant seeds that grew in ways no one could predict as the day went on. Small groups began to leave, still talking about what they had experienced. Some people went online immediately, sharing clips they had recorded, describing what had happened with words that tried and often failed to capture the depth of the moment. The story began to spread. People outside the square started hearing about the man who had turned laughter into awe, mockery into respect, and strangers into witnesses of something extraordinary. The man did not chase the recognition. He did not seek fame or approval. He walked through the square slowly, absorbing the quiet admiration in the air. He noticed small things, a smile from a passerby, a nod from a vendor who had stopped calling out prices, a quiet whisper of appreciation from someone who had been skeptical. All of it mattered, though he did not make a show of it. He had found what he needed in the music itself, in the act of playing. In the sharing of something real and meaningful, he reached the edge of the square, and for a moment paused. He looked back at the piano, the same worn instrument that had waited for him all these years. The paint was chipped, the keys scratched, but it had not failed him. It had carried his music faithfully, had amplified not just the notes, but the emotions behind them. He ran his hand lightly over the top, a small gesture of gratitude for the companion that had never judged, that had never let him down. People continued to talk quietly behind him, still discussing the unexpected event. Some smiled as they walked away, inspired. Others shook their heads, amazed at the power of hidden talent. It was a lesson in patience, in humility, in recognizing that the quiet, unnoticed, and underestimated could surprise the world in the most beautiful ways. The man turned his attention inward as he walked. He thought about how life had been full of challenges, full of doors that had closed, full of moments that seemed to demand survival over passion. Yet he realized that every struggle, every quiet day, every overlooked opportunity had led him to this moment. He had played not only for himself but for all the unseen, unheard, underestimated people who carried talent quietly within them. He had played for the invisible, for the forgotten, for the world that often looked but did not see. Back in the square, some people remained behind, reflecting. They shared stories of their own experiences, their own hidden skills and dreams, their own moments of being overlooked. The music had reminded them that talent and perseverance could be hidden in plain sight. It was a shared lesson, quietly absorbed without speeches or declarations. The man's piano playing had become a symbol of possibility, of hope, and of the quiet strength that resides in every human heart. As evening approached, the square gradually returned to its usual rhythm. Vendors called out, buses rumbled, children laughed and ran, yet the memory of the man and his music lingered. People who had witnessed it carried the image in their minds, felt the echo in their hearts. The lesson remained: never judge too quickly, never dismiss what seems small, and always leave space for the unexpected brilliance that may exist in the most overlooked places. The man walked to a quiet corner, sitting on another bench to rest. He thought about the people who had laughed at him, the ones who had mocked and doubted. He did not feel anger or resentment. He felt gratitude that he had the courage to play, despite their judgment. The music had spoken, the world had listened, and for once, he felt a connection that had been missing for years. A few people returned, curious to see him, to hear more, to ask questions. He welcomed them simply, encouraging them to listen, to try, to explore their own talents. He shared small advice quietly, not as a teacher seeking fame, but as someone who understood the power of perseverance, practice, and courage. Every word was gentle, honest, human. Night began to fall, casting long shadows across the square. The man rose slowly, stretching, feeling the relief and satisfaction of the day. The piano was quiet, resting until the next time someone would need it, until the next moment of music and life. He looked back one last time, a small smile on his face, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey that had led him here. People around him continued to talk, some heading home, others lingering for a few more moments. The impact of what had happened was already spreading beyond the square. Stories, videos, whispered impressions, they would travel further than he could imagine. Yet the man knew that the true magic was in the moment, in the honesty of his music. In the connection with those who had been present, he walked through the square one final time that day, slowly, thoughtfully, aware that something inside him had changed. He had reclaimed a piece of his life that had long been hidden. He had shared his gift with the world and reminded people, silently but powerfully, that true talent and human spirit could not be denied forever. As he disappeared from the square, the echoes of his piano playing seemed to linger in the air. People would remember quietly or aloud. They would recall the man who had transformed their laughter into awe, who had shared his life and soul through music, and who had taught them that the quietest voices often hold the most extraordinary stories. And for the man himself, a long-hidden peace settled in his heart, a confirmation that he had finally been seen, heard, and understood in the way that mattered most.